Kristin Bergtora Sandvik is a research professor in humanitarian studies at the Peace Research Institute Oslo and a professor of sociology of law at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law at the University of Oslo. Her research focuses on digital transformation of the humanitarian sector, refugee resettlement, legal mobilization by victims of gender-based violence in war, and the socio-legal ripple effects of terror attacks. So, Kristin, the floor is yours.
So thank you, and thank you for having me. One moment, yeah. So I can just start out by saying that when I was with you in 2021, I talked about a paper on seeing a post-terror litigation as transitional justice. After the Norwegian terror attack. That paper is coming out in the International Journal of Transitional Justice, hopefully very soon. But partly because of this engagement, I was invited to go to Georgia last fall to give a very, I think, general introduction on transitional justice to a mixed forum of Belarusian, Russian, and Ukrainian activists. And they were convened in Tbilisi for the first time. So this was the first time these activist groups were brought together. And I was in a panel with very distinguished Russian lawyers. And about 5 minutes before the panel started, one of them said, this is nothing against you, Kristin, but, transitional justice after empire. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is a completely hopeless project, and I'm quitting the panel. And that was quite interesting. So I did did a double take and tried to do as best as I could and sort of presenting the liberal legalist outlines of transitional justice. That's not my like. And then I've been traveling with the paper ever since. So this is something I've never done before. I've sort of variously been with activists and in academic settings, and I'll walk you through this sort of ongoing experiment. And I think for my background, it probably helps to know that I have a background as a human rights activist. I've worked with Bosnian refugee kids in the mid-90s. I'm a child of the 90s very much. Co-founded human rights, children's rights NGO in Norway, and have sort of kept a life as a practitioner academic. Yeah. So basically what I've done is, this has been in Georgia, then I went to Berlin in sort of a very politicized conference in February in the politics of memory as a weapon. I went to my own people in Lund for social legal studies. Then I was back with the activists in Vilnius last month, and now I'm here. So the paper is sort of it's not a travelogue, it's more serious than this, but I hope to show you some of the challenges that a transitional justice project is facing, but also what kind of conversation we can calibrate moving forward. Because I think having this conversation about justice, but also daring to speak about peace is absolutely necessary. We're going through an unprecedented militarization of public discourse, but also of academic discourse. We're talking about peace has become almost like, supporting Putin's agenda, which I strongly resist. So 3 points: what is transitional justice, the problem at hand, and how to move the conversation forward. And the pictures are not excellent because they're mine, but I hope they provide some illustrations. So if we do sort of the general transitional justice lecture, how societies respond to the legacies of massive and serious human rights violations. Over the last 40 years, we have amassed a lot of very famous cases. So the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission marking the end of the apartheid regime is the first really big case. Northern Ireland, Good Friday Agreement, Colombia, Ley de Víctimas. I was working in Colombia when that law came. We were mapping all the internally displaced victims organizations in the country. And one day they just said, you guys are completely outdated. We're no longer internally displaced. We're now victims of internal displacement. But my partner in that project left, and she's now a judge in this transitional justice system. And then there's the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Indigenous People. We had the same in Norway, the report being made public last week. So we have a lot of different cases now. Transitional justice has become a very, not industry, but a very global project with many manifestations. So the basic components would be truth-seeking, repairing victims, making sure that things are not going to happen again, securing some sort of justice, and also maintaining memory, sort of maintaining one shared memory of what happened, who was the victims, and what kind of violence was inflicted. So that would be sort of the nuts and bolts. It's very connected to liberal democracy. It's connected with the past, the present, and the future. And it has this very founding idea that a definitive break with the past is both possible and necessary to move forward. And in the context we're finding ourselves now, I mean, this is a very challenging thing. And then there's this less articulated, I think, shared notion of what's the appropriate toolbox in the time frame. So it's very organized or orientated towards law. And in the current context, very much about punitive measures. It's very much about punishing, setting up the ICC, suing Putin, preparing for a lot of court cases against Russian military officials, which is completely dominating the legal project of ending the war. The legitimacy and the funding cycles are also very much tied up with the notion that this can be wrapped up neatly and within a relatively short time frame. And this time frame is also a problem. So how does all of this look after empire? And this is about, I think I skipped, is this right? But it's here. Kristin has made a mistake in her PowerPoint. The problems at hand. What you see here is a Berlin bookshop window. And it's reversed, but you can see that all the books exhibited are about war. So we are, as the speakers yesterday really pointed out, there's upheaval, there's change, there's Russia, there's China, there's the US, there's the UK, and other countries sort of trying to find their new ways of engaging with the world, and sometimes not agreeing on how this is going to be done. Very broad militarization of Europe. The lack of discussion about this is stunning to me. The lack of willingness to scrutinize budgets, this idea that military budgets going up is uniquely a positive thing, the disinterest in looking at the lobbyists and who gains what. But also, as was pointed out yesterday, rising inequality and ordinary people opting out of democratic processes, for example. So there are a lot of problems here in how we sort of live together and how we think about the world we're in. If we look at the specific activists from Russia, but also Belarus and Ukraine, they don't agree on what needs to happen or what is happening. So about half of them will at any given time say that the empire is in rapid inevitable decline, Putin is dying soon in natural courses, and so is Kadyrov, so is the president of Turkey, so is any bad guy, right? They're going to die soon. Lukashenko, look at him, he's collapsing in a moment. And that the population will at some point, contrary to what has been seen so far, rise up. The other half will say that nothing is going to happen. The West is delusional if they think that the sanctions are going to bite and repression is going to continue unabated. There's also the question of what to do with Russia in particular, but also Belarus. So, one half of the room will say that Russia will not be able to rescue itself. It needs global steering and assistance. We need to continue where we, make things better from the 90s, but essentially try to do something. And the other half will say can only change from within, has to rescue itself. So obviously there's no shared understanding of what happens or what needs to happen either. At the same time, I think as a European and being a Norwegian, we tried not to be European, but we're sort of European. It's a grand favor to the European project. I mean, I think this should not be underestimated. And it's just a surprise of it all. It turns out that the UK has been, the most European of everyone. But unity display, everyone has been incredibly impressed by Ukrainians. So this has brought European Union together in a way that couldn't have happened in any other way, I think. So there's not an advantage, but there's something here that needs to be recognized. So how do we move this conversation forward? This is a wall in Vilnius. Russia can't be wished away. I live in a country with a shared border. It's an Arctic border. The border is still open. You can cross without a passport. Lots of family have transnational lives. We need to calibrate this conversation and going beyond punishment. I saw yesterday that the Czech, I think, president wants to put all Russians under surveillance because they're potential individual enemies. This is really wrong. So what kind of imaginaries do we need? And what is the role for us as scholars in offering these imaginaries? And this is not so easy these days because you are looked upon as weird or ignorant or as disloyal. So if we look at the post-communist transitional justice literature in itself, and in any book chapter, as you know, this would fill out 4 pages of heavily annotated, cited literature review. It's been very confined. It's been sort of a post-Soviet project. So it looked at initiatives, particularly illustration, criminal trials, restoration, but very few truth and reconciliation commissions in the post-Soviet and Central European territory. A couple of country cases, a lot of explicit skepticism versus progress narratives from other regions. It's like, we're not like this, we're different, we're not the same as Argentina, as South Africa, as Northern Ireland, as Colombia. So this insistence of being special. And also, of course, a lot of criticism of manipulation and abuse of how the state is engaging in strategic forgetting, but very much an unwillingness to be having a global conversation. Then there's also, of course, a specific transitional justice literature in Ukraine, which is very much about criminal procedures and vetting post-Maidan, decommunization laws addressing Soviet past, fairly unsuccessful illustration, and then restoration of territorial integrity around Donbass. So my argument is that we need to sort of shift these literatures into something broader, and then see this as a European polity issue. It's not only about Ukraine and about the end of Putin. So what you see here is the Ukrainian flag in some rural mailboxes in Norway. But this is a European project. This is a European issue. And it should be so for us as scholars as well. And I think just accepting this sort of isolated state of this academic debate, I think is unacceptable. So as one of the activists said, what kind of Europe do we want to live in the future for our children in 2 generations? Russia's and Belarus' fate is also a European question. I think we have decided that Ukraine is a European question, but these other things are also a European question. So the challenges are, and this is again, as what we do as academics here in documenting what's going on, in analyzing and in advocating. So I think all of you have read this book. Memory hole features quite visibly in 1984. So memory hole is any mechanism for the deliberate alteration of disappearance of documents, images, records, rewriting history to match changing state agendas. So Memorial, the Russian Nobel laureate from last year, said, "However horrible the past may have been, forgetting it would make the future even worse." So this was what they said in the first meeting we had in Georgia. But how do we do this? How do we carve out a set of shared local, national, regional pasts? This is complicated, and it's getting more complicated by the day as Europe also gets caught up in this sort of not hate mongering, but fear mongering maybe. And for us as academics, how do we avoid giving historical ground? How do we avoid giving into, how do we stay unbiased, careful, and systematic? I frequently get a little bit annoyed with historians because they are so immovable. They spent their life on researching this, and they're not going to do anything but researching this. But this is a quality. Historians are having a very, very hard time in the current university systems. This is an argument for giving them less of a hard time because they do have this incredibly valuable way of working. The second one is resisting doublethink. Here is outside my workplace where we're crowdfunding armed drones to Ukraine last year, and no, just drones. This would have been unthinkable a couple of years ago. That you would think it was a great thing for people to get together to fund drones that would be used in war. It's a very, very odd social movement thing to be engaged in, but now it's there everywhere. So doublethink is a project of indoctrination in which subjects are expected to simultaneously accept 2 conflicting beliefs as true. and asking to both, suspend disbelief and politically inconvenient pasts. And of course, for people living in Russia and Belarus, this is the same. This is extremely challenging. So one of my colleagues in Vilnius, she said that she'd been back to the border. Her family lives in a border area between Belarus and Ukraine, and the mom, critical of Lukashenko, but loves Putin. Think he's a great guy and he can't lie. And they have said that at some point they had said that no weapons, no missiles had been fired from Belarusian territory into Ukraine. This was an official state narrative. And then she said, but I saw it. The mother said, I saw it. I was sitting in my kitchen and we live so close that, everything was shaking and I saw them. I saw the missiles going from our territory into Ukraine. What do I do with this? And so for ordinary people, it's a real challenge, but also for us and sort of the European side. Human rights defenders are they're obviously persecuted at home, disbarred lawyers, people are killed, jailed. I mean, this has been going on for a long time, but a lot of these people now face difficulties in getting asylum and protection in other European states and are seen, viewed with suspicion, and it's difficult to get funding for a lot of initiatives that you thought we would actually now run to fund, and they're being seen as foreign agents. And that's this idea that militarization is good and peace is bad, but also securitization of collaborative practices. So I guess a lot of you heard about this Russian spy in Tromsø who claimed to be Brazilian and didn't speak Portuguese. We have made a joke of this, saying, the guy obviously failed spy school, and where do you send people that face fake, you send them to Norway because the Norwegians are so gullible. Just go and pretend you're Brazilian or whatever. But it's hard. Like I noticed this in my own seminars, like when people show up, when they can't be traced, when they have dubious credentials, it's sort of sneaking in to this suspicion. So Jon Elster, also Norwegian, wrote a very important book on transitional justice almost 20 years ago. But there's something here when we who work with transitional justice, we have a problem with the timelines. In Colombia, the timelines were so clear. It was dung, 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 you have 6 years. Here's the monthly plan for your progress. Here, there seems to be no timeline. Before this war, there was a specific criticism of how the West was rushing in the transition of the post-Soviet states. So Andrea said in 2015, it's perhaps a legacy of the Cold War that the West asks so much of Russia so soon. Be more patient and abandon short timeframes when evaluating success in transitional justice initiatives. I mean, that comment seems to be almost appropriate today. At the same time, things aren't going faster just because we think they should. This here is it's actually a copy of the German liquidation list from a Norwegian newspaper in 1942. If you had seen the list for S, you would have seen my grandmother's uncle. I discovered last fall that 10 of my relatives had been refugees in Sweden during the war because they were on this list. I didn't know I had Jewish family. So for all of us, it's we keep discovering the past. There seems to be a lot of the past that we want to deal with. This is 80 years ago. The pain sort of stays and lingers. And as one of the Russian lawyers said, the sheer number of crimes and impossibility of dealing with them and the inevitability of disappointment makes it just really, really hard to move forward. So what does this post-empire timeline then look like? Or maybe more importantly, how do we sort of articulate a shared future time? And so this is like, how do we table a conversation at all? In a room with activists from very different countries that are even at war with each other, but also in a room of Europeans, in a room of transatlantic relationships that are in tension, and what sort of words do we use? So what kind of vocabulary? And it's also like instrumental, right? If you're going to get any of this funded, you actually have to have some hooks of hope. And this is another challenge for the activists, right? They have to pretend they're optimists, even when they're not. Otherwise, nobody wants to sort of support them. So Bell Hooks says, it's imperative that we maintain hope, even when the harshness of reality may suggest the opposite. Hope is a political act. It's a refusal to give in to despair. This is Paulo Freire. When we only name the problem, when we start complaints without a constructive focus on resolution, we take away hope. In this way, critique can become merely an expression of profound cynicism, which then works to sustain dominator culture. So we need to overcome memory holes. We need to deal with double thinks. We need to try to work on a timeline, but we also need to find sort of ways of speaking about hope and how we can move forward. And we as activists, academics, many of us sitting in our safe offices, should care about this and try to do something. And I'll just end with what the activists said, because it's sort of hopeful. So there was a Ukrainian woman there who said, she was also an academic actually, from the first day of the war, all social hierarchies got destroyed and people started helping each other. And this is, you know, at some point she was talking about her experiences of one day being academic, the other day going out on the road, trying to count shoes from a car that's been exploded. You know, here's a children's shoe, here are a couple of adult shoes. Here are the cows that needs milking upstream because people abandoned the farm. Here's the food that needs to be distributed. And then someone, she starts crying, obviously, and you know, the room full of Russians and Belarusians start clapping. They don't say, you know, I'm sorry, or how do you feel, or blah, blah, blah. They start clapping, and they clap until she collects herself. That was a very touching moment, I have to say. And then, you know, like reminding ourselves, 1945, the ruins upon the future is being constructed. Humanity was optimistic enough to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then, you know, this Russian says, you know, Russia can't hide from globalization. It's going to work its way with young people. And this is about misinformation, you know, but at some point, young people will not be, misinformation is an enormous problem in Russia today. But at the same time, you know, this global information cycle is also good for something. And then, of course, there is about amplifying Russian voices. You know, we can't scrap everything. We can't think that 20, 30 years of post-Soviet civil society building has been in vain. And then, you know, the Russians, and this is a Russian saying, the chance for new Russia lies in sympathy, solidarity with Ukraine. And the Belarusian, it's about seeing each other to meet each other. So there's a lot of things to work with here and on here. Coming from people who are deeply affected themselves, who are staking their lives on this, and who can still be in the same room. And I hope that we, working on transitional justice, can try to provide some of that analytical structure in the conversations we're having. And then I'm just going to end with the same quote that I always end with. Not in our lifetime doesn't mean there is no timeline or timeline without hope. But work is just going to take a long time. Thank you.
Our second presentation will focus on the international peace architecture, and it will be presented by Oliver Richmond. Oliver, like many others, is traveling a lot, and he tried to be here with us today, but could not manage. But we are happy that he will be with us online. I think he is already online, but still don't see it. In the meantime, I will introduce Oliver. Oliver Richmond is Professor of International Relations, Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Manchester, and an International Research Professor in the School of Law and Government and Dublin City University. His research focuses on critical international relations and peace and conflict studies. He introduced key elements of the liberal peace critique related to peace building and state building, and is among the leading proponents of what has become known as the local turn in peace building.
Very good. Thanks so much for the invitation. Sorry I couldn't be there. Logistics and so on, and too much travel recently, and too much failed travel recently made it rather difficult. And I understand that you also had problems at your end, which I'm sorry to hear about, but it seems to be, I know, part of the zeitgeist of the times that everything is going backwards. Anyway, I'm talking about innovations in the international peace architecture this morning, and it will probably come as a little surprise that I don't have a very clear idea about specific and technical innovations, but I have some sense about directions of travel. So what I'd like to do for my talk this morning is to talk a little bit about this international peace architecture framing device that I've been developing recently, and how it applies also to the liberal peace critique and to the so-called local turn, to hybridity, and all of these things that sort of came into general use in various aspects of international relations and peace and conflict studies over a decade ago, and what all of that means for where we are and how we're looking for a way out of it, as a kind of closing point. I have this sort of sense myself that this international peace architecture is a very complex historical set of systems, processes, dynamics, sediments, actors, ideologies, theories and methodologies. It's a very complex, unwieldy edifice in which we can sort of draw together, as some of the great thinkers, before us have done, a grab bag of plausible tools that we can use to remedy, mitigate, and mediate, negotiate, or resolve conflicts. And in general, what we haven't tended to do across the full range, the several hundred years of debates about peace and its relationship with political order, is we haven't often tried to sketch it out in systemic terms. So I began to try to do that in a recent book of mine called The Grand Design, The Evolution of the International Peace Architecture. And this book was drawing on a sort of idea that had been circulating after, kind of Renaissance idea that had been circulating after the Enlightenment, and had kind of, followed through many different paths in interdisciplinary debates, from archaeology to political philosophy to the arts, that these sorts of systems kind of build up in sedimentary style into a kind of topply but complex edifice, a kind of confederation of thoughts, ideas, and practices, rather than a centralized governmental form. That was a central insight of a chap called Duc de Sully many hundreds of years ago, which was sort of a motivating feature of the debates that we saw culminate in Kant's Perpetual Peace, which has traveled to us through the 20th century in the building of an international system, a liberal international system, which is now in some trouble. I think there's an assumption that this international peace architecture is really shaped by its liberal iterations, but I think this is only one small part, one stage, or one sediment in this architecture. It's far broader and deeper than that. And also the liberal stuff that we've been working with since the end of World War II, at least, is, well, inflexible, out of date, very limited. It's not globally representative, and it excludes a range of issues and has methodological dynamics which make, let's say, subaltern voices, non-Western voices or non-Northern voices, claims against political economy, secondary to the international political economy, conceptualizations of security, centralized authority, and territorial sovereignty, checked and balanced, of course, by those liberal systems. This is under deep stress, I think. And there has been an argument that's been made recently that, we'll save this international system by seeing it kind of disaggregated into a more multipolar version. And I think we've heard hints of that in yesterday's proceedings too, which I listened to online. But to me, and just to sort of give the game away, this is back to the future. These multipolar systems tried and failed in the 19th century and collapsed much of 20th century history, not to mention the cost in human life. And the rationalities upon which they were predicated are very basic rationalities, and they've made a return. But the kind of hierarchies, categories, rationalizations, and assumptions they make really mean that there's very little peacemaking capacity in a multipolar international order. It's in fact so limited that crises are more prevalent than peacemaking. And I think that's something that we're starting to see in the contemporary order. So they seem, multipolar versions of this order seem very unlikely to work. They'll mainly be focused on counterinsurgency, digital surveillance, faulty regional balancing, marginalizing or walling off the UN system, and defunding civil society. And we've seen all of those things happening. So this kind of dichotomy is based on the idea that every viable, legitimate political order with integrity, able to, let's say, maintain the possibility of the present and the potential of the future, has to have peacemaking tools that work. And these peacemaking tools, you know, at their very basic, introduce non-violence into political exchanges, not just diplomatic exchanges, but informal political exchanges, and probably expand but control the conversations that are had around political issues, and also the actors, subjects, and participants in those issues. And I mean, that sort of encapsulates for me the long history of the very slow evolution of peacemaking tools. They're designed to preserve political order. Political order will collapse if they don't work. And they are really about controlling entry, access, participation, voice, dialogue, and implementation of those outcomes through various means, from politics to law, from constitutions to borders and territorialism, identity, to the building of international organizations and law. I think we've seen a new intervention in these debates over the last latter half of the 20th century, and it's really sort of reaching a bit of a crescendo now, drawing on the critical debates too, which offer us an idea, and this is what the liberal peace critique was trying to do, that there must be alternatives out there. Not just are we thinking, therefore, about micro reframings of peacemaking tools for, let's say, everyday conflicts, but we're also thinking about doing more than removing violence. We're thinking about building long-term sustainable political orders. And the question is, what will that order be based on? If it's not based on territory, boundaries, centralized power and security, as we can sort of see in the liberal internationalist system, the liberal peace system, and also in those multipolar versions that many pundits and quite a few scholars suggest are what are coming, or coming back at least. Post-colonial and decolonial versions of these sorts of discussions, I think, have been interesting because they point, well, in a very confusing way in a number of directions. But I think the key outcome is there are big justice questions that have been unresolved in previous versions of this international order, which have limited the reach, integrity, and capacity of these peacemaking tools that have been designed to maintain that order. Of course, they also point in different directions towards self-determination, autonomy, the constitution of statehood, its co-optation into state formation, and the resurgence of authoritarianism and nationalism and these sorts of things. But in terms of their sort of underlying ethical appeal, going beyond the limited belonging of political community, I think we do start to see very significant structural issues being raised about the nature of the international system, the way it's dealt with historical, distributive, in other words, global justice questions. And most of our peacemaking tools, ranging across the political, the civil, the international, the legal, the developmental, tend to stop short of these big justice questions. That's been a huge deficit, both in the 19th century in the multipolar version, in the 20th century in the liberal version, in the 21st century in attempts to strip it back to something more like a kind of neoliberal night watchman type international system. So what we have, you know, are a series of attempts in the longue durée to design different forms of the international, which incorporate increasingly diverse communities that are connected and networked in increasingly substantial ways, and to instill in that system practices, policies, and norms of nonviolence, and tools to help recover from violence, from its many structural, human, and infrastructural, political, social, and economic consequences. And these are becoming, they're becoming more and more sophisticated. So in a way, this is a story of linear kind of Whiggish progression of the history of the international peace architecture. And this decolonial, post-colonial intervention recently, which points in particular to the failure of peacemaking and political order that it's aimed at producing, to deal with questions of global inequality on micro and macro levels, to deal with questions of justice, pointing to debates about reparations, as well as sustainability, has also opened the way for more environmental or anthropocenic discussions about the nature of political order, another dimension of peacemaking, which has gained a little bit of traction in the literature and doctrinally, let's say, in conventions at the international level, but not really in practice so far. I think what this means is a lot of the critical debates about the liberal peace have been surpassed. The liberal peace is just a part of this overall architecture, which is much broader and wider, which runs from the informal to the formal, from the localized subaltern to the elite in the international political economy, in international organizations, the legal, the political, and the economic. And when you think about it this way, it's a broad and deep system with a wide, very wide range of, let's say, discordant voices engaged in, one, trying to deal with the problem of nonviolence, two, trying to build a political order locally and internationally that sustains those principles and also brings about social, economic, and political progress with some kind of cultural recognition as well at the international level for political communities that emerge. So this is a complex and existential problem, and a system which has been designed inadvertently over time matches it to some degree. I don't want to go any further into the international peace architecture because I've got a few other things to say, and it's kind of convoluted and complex and boring and detailed, and you could read about it in lots of people's contributions to these debates and also my book if you wanted to. But what I will say is that the peace architecture has a few characteristics which are highly problematic, not to say dangerous, to the existential level. It is designed reactively. New layers of this architecture have emerged historically after major systemic conflict, after norms of nonviolence, after political order at local, international, regional, state levels has collapsed, which means that it's always fighting the last war. Its versions of peace are also problematic for numerous reasons. But one main one that I'll point to is these versions of peace that come through in these different layers. If you take the standard Eurocentric argument, it's 1815, 1918, 1945, 1992, 2015, and so on. The version of peace that comes through is also very old-fashioned. We're still drawing on Kant in the 21st century. We're still drawing on the canon of liberalism. We're only now engaging with voices beyond that very narrow sphere of intellectual achievement. It's not that they didn't make a major contribution to this architecture, because they have. Without them, it wouldn't exist. Let's say the great liberal thinkers. But it's certainly run its course, and much more effort is required for the next stages of the architecture. So the architecture builds up in layers. After each systemic crisis, each new layer attempts to build a new political order and to design new tools. The tools have gone from the very basic conference diplomacy and balance of power to the much more sophisticated peace building, development, state building, kind of human security oriented local participatory approaches, the local everyday hybridity sorts of arguments, complex, convoluted, far reaching, always kind of toying or dabbling with the problem of intervention. How far do these run with the consent of their subjects, and how far do they run against the consent of subjects? Representation, the alien and distant, centrally coordinated at multiple sites elsewhere. And there are other kind of substantial problems with them too. But the point here is that they were and have been trying to uphold some kind of norm of nonviolence upon which to build a political order, and increasingly have opened up the discussion about what the nature of that order is. But as the tools have got more sophisticated and these debates have become more complex, it's become more difficult to gain, let's say, local legitimacy for these kind of treaty-based, elite-oriented settlement processes, or these IPE-oriented good government or global governance-oriented settlements of the international political economy. So what's happened with the international peace architecture is not only does it break down at certain points of crisis, but it also slowly loses legitimacy as these new layers are designed and developed. It leaches legitimacy for a number of reasons, both at the international level, amongst those who are supposed to be supporting it and funding it, and also at the local level, those who are supposed to be participating in this new political order and its peacemaking tools. So this sort of leads me to a kind of counter argument about this international peace architecture. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is, of course, struggling against all kinds of political forces, geopolitics, social, political, class stratifications in context, the international political economy, the scarcity of resources, the scarcity of territory, the intent of power to centralize itself, corruption, and so on. And I think just to kind of draw an analogy here, we can think about the breakdown of many of the peace processes that started in the late 20th century and are still running with us today. You know, from Northern Ireland through to Cambodia, Timor-Leste, Bosnia, the Balkans, Kosovo in the news today, and of course, attempts in sub-Saharan Africa, Sierra Leone, Mali, CAR, you know, where we've seen concerted attempts, I forgot to mention the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, concerted attempts to build a kind of liberal internationalist, liberal democratic constitutional order using a number of levers of tools, developmental, political, diplomatic, economic, and social tools, to build a kind of liberalizing platform for a peace process, which would be captured in a document, signed and implemented. Instead, we've seen resistance to that, a kind of reactionary resistance. And I think this is also what we see as the international peace architecture has built up historically. And this reactionary resistance exists because peacemaking in international and localized orders is all about fragmenting power structures. These power structures are long-standing power structures, and they exist for a reason, and for some they are legitimate. And so the attempt of these kind of weak peacemaking tools without direct control of the levers of power to fragment these power structures could work for a while after a crisis in a political vacuum. But as those forces reassemble themselves, they stop working. What we've ended up with, I think, over the last 30 years is a lot of refrigerated and frozen peace processes that are locked into stalemate. And I've tried to develop a conceptualization for this, which I'll call the counterpiece. And the counterpiece is, in kind of simplistic terms, it is the opposition to peacemaking. It maintains the utility of force and violence in politics. It maintains the legitimacy of stratification in socio-political and economic and cultural spaces. It maintains historic boundaries, borders, centralized forms of authority, and sense of belonging, i.e. nationalism. So this is kind of reactionary, it may appear to many critical thinkers, historical kind of form of politics, which should be consigned to the graveyard of history, and yet it's extremely powerful. And peacemaking, peace building, mediation, diplomacy, and development, state reform, constitutional design, all of these strategies have to engage with these power structures. Loosely, we've called this power sharing, and I think power sharing as a system has failed when it's connected to peacemaking, at least in the last 20 years or so. Because what we've ended up is a lot of frozen conflicts, particularly ones where we have signed treaty documents or unsigned documents, as we recently saw in the case of Kosovo, which are left on the table, unimplemented, but play some kind of symbolic role. which reduce violence, but don't necessarily remove it from the political terrain, which suggest reforms could be made along these tracks, but then become bogged down in endless post-treaty negotiations, which lead nowhere. And what we eventually end up with is an attempt to buy time for a more substantial structural rejigging of power and political authority, not a liberal one, not a Western-oriented one, not even one that's in line with international law. So this is a counterpeace framework, and I see a rough pattern for counterpeace. So these are the warning signs. If you're looking for a moment when this
Oliver, 2 more minutes, please.
Yeah, when this international peace architecture has become too fragile and its impact and capacity has become negated, we can see that there is an increasingly weak set of civil society and social actors, which are disengaged or excluded from discussions about a peace treaty or state reform at the state level and at the regional level, and are defunded by international donors. State elites, or elites in general, are increasingly rapacious, particularly over their control of the state, as we've seen in Cambodia, and we've seen in Bosnia, and so on. And they use this again as a vehicle for a kind of state formation project, not a peace formation, grassroots from below up to state and international. And at the same time, the third dynamic of counterpeace is that the international community is divided. There's a loss of political will and legitimacy for its peacemaking tools, and it's withdrawn. So this weak civil society, powerful elites, withdrawn international suggests that peace processes are in a stalemate, are refrigerated, are slowly collapsing. And furthermore, from some research I've been doing at the University of Manchester and also Dublin with Gazim Vasoka and Sandra Pagoda and a few others, we suggest that these kinds of counterpeace processes gain the upper hand over time. And it's very difficult to pull a peace process back. And what this suggests, and I'll bring this to a conclusion, is that the political order that peace processes are supporting is about to collapse. Now that is both at the state level and at the international level. So we're drawing a direct line between the slow collapse of peace processes and the failure of a specific international order and its contestation, a reversion to multipolarity, if you like. So it's in that sort of terrain that we need to think about innovations. And I think there are a number of areas where we can think about innovations, but I'm out of time, so I'll just give you one headline. We have been very bad at connecting peace with justice. We have, throughout history, circumscribed the nature of justice when we talk about it in relation to peace. And we've done that for pragmatic reasons, because it's just too big, it's too broad, it's too far-reaching, goes back too far, it has too much breadth across human societies, and raises a very powerful array of structural issues. But it's for that reason that most peace processes became susceptible to the counterpeace, and why the international peace architecture has weakened. And I think throughout the kind of Whiggish linear development of thinking about peace and the nature of progressive political order in Western and other political philosophies, there is a tendency to go further than that and to start thinking about how we can both redesign political order, which is more inclusive but also more representative. So there is a polylogue in this political order, or it's pluriversal, an international order which is also more redistributive. So we're talking here about issues of global justice, environmental, gender, historical, distributive forms of justice, and a much tighter connection with these small micro tools of peacemaking and the international order itself. It's pie in the sky stuff, so was perpetual peace. But you can see how the international peace architecture is failing. Over time, it's built up in all these different layers. It now needs a new layer to deal with these new hybrid and digital forms of warfare, conflict, political violence, as well as the neoliberal extractions and the failures of social policies, the collapse of the welfare state, and the, let's say, dilution of global public goods. These are the big issues that we need to start thinking about how we address, both in terms of international reform, in terms of political reform that goes across the scales, in the context of networks around the world which now far transcend the kinds of networks that existed when the previous version of the international peace architecture was designed in the 20th century. Just one last sentence, if I may. There's a lot there, and I'm sorry for all that dense material, but just to finish it up with something kind of straightforward. My reading of the history of peacemaking, which is a very sort of small part of the overall story here, and I'm not trying to claim that it's a major thing, but my reading is that innovative tools in peacemaking, as well as modes of thinking, so that includes methods, epistemologies, frameworks, tend to come from associations, networks, dialogues, polylogues between civil society, social movements, communities, scholars, and policymakers. They tend to lead to kind of doctrinal knowledge, which is not implemented in practice, but exists in the fora of public goods around the world as a plausible way forward, one that hasn't been implemented and can't be achieved. Every time there's a systemic crisis in international relations, an existential crisis in regional or international politics, policymakers and politicians, statesmen and women, and all the rest of it, officials, go back to that body of knowledge. And they try to implement it because there's nothing else when it comes to dealing with making peace after the latest round of systemic conflict. And it's that process that's been building the international architecture. It's why it's so reactive and why the architecture is so weak. And often it takes 200 or 300 years for that knowledge to filter into the policy setting, ridiculous as it may sound. That's been speeding up, I think, a lot recently, particularly over the last 30 years. We've gone from agenda for peace to the Sustainable Development Goals much more quickly than we went from perpetual peace to liberal internationalism. So there are some signs, that the spaces for innovation are present, and I think we have a clearer grip on how this happens. But what we don't have are the actual practical tools, systems in place, and I think that's quite risky. In the past, they came into place after the crisis, after the collapse. This time, it behoves us to preempt that process. And if we do, it'll be the first time I think it's ever happened. And I'll stop there. Thanks for listening to me. Sorry for going over a little bit.
And I'll now introduce our third speaker. Marsha Henry is Associate Professor at the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics. Marsha was a founding member of the Center for Women, Peace and Security, where she served as Deputy Director and Interim Director. Her interests focus on gender and development, gender and militarization, with a focus on social experiences of living and working in peacekeeping missions. And Marsha will now speak about gendered, racialized, militarized politics of peacekeeping. Marsha, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation, and thanks for redoing this in person. I love it, and it seems to have generated so many new connections. So there's been a beautiful duplicity in it, it's actually really suited for tall people. I'm not sure what you were talking about. I've really enjoyed this second engagement, and so many I think wonderful conversations that started yesterday. So I'm gonna take you on into a very different zone, although I think Oliver slightly prepared us for thinking about peace. So this is really about, I guess, about global governance. I have two starting points in this work. I have the conceptual starting point, a kind of conceptual problem or a kind of theoretical sort of irritation in a way. And then I also have this sort of large body of empirical material that I've amassed in a way over almost 20 years of field work. in peacekeeping context. So I've been trying to reconcile, I guess, this ongoing kind of conceptual sort of irritation or sort of questioning with these observations and interviews and focus groups and discussions and impressions from fieldwork in peacekeeping missions. So this conceptual irritation that I have has been around, really it's about my own navigation into learning about peacekeeping. So I think I have a very privileged avenue to which I've come to understand the peacekeeping scholarship and scholarship on global governance more generally. And so I've had this interdisciplinary training. I mean, training, it sounds a little bit like a dog, but I mean, this interdisciplinary education, this interdisciplinary sort of exploration. And so I came to learn about peacekeeping through, I think, very different routes. I didn't take a very traditional international relations approach. I didn't approach peacekeeping literature from perhaps a peace and conflict studies program or even a development studies program. I came at peacekeeping, or I came to know about peacekeeping through reading and learning from feminist activists or feminist security studies practitioners. So I came to peacekeeping this way. So one of the dilemmas that I've encountered in the peacekeeping scholarship is this divide between different approaches to thinking about peacekeeping. So this divide generally falls along this line that I've and that I and others like Oliver, for example, think of. So the kind of critical approaches to understanding peacekeeping that draw on a range of critical theories and concepts. And then what I would call the more problem-solving approaches, the approaches that are interested in finding out what the problems are of effectivity, of operational sort of logistics, what can we do to make peacekeeping better? And I would say those two literatures have sort of been, side by side for quite some time. And there are occasional people who speak between those two literatures or who perhaps sit in a more hybrid or third way position. But in general, those two positions are how I saw the literature in the early stages. What I found much more recently in the last really 10 years is that the problem-solving literature is the dominant literature. It's the literature that has taken over peacekeeping scholarship. It's the approach that is most called upon by the United Nations in all of their sort of peacekeeping activity, policy, procedures, processes. So, and this is really interesting that actually former military commanders, for example, now write together with problem-solving peacekeeping scholars, academics. So you get actually texts that are written by both people who have experience in the field and on the ground, and those more traditionally trained academics. So I found this this eclipsing of this critical literature that I was exposed to really in the early 2000s. A bit of an interesting kind of erasure. What's going on with this? Why hasn't this critical? Well, I think we kind of know why some of that critical literature has faded or has become somewhat irrelevant. But I thought about this kind of three themes that came up in the critical literature that I found really compelling and that stayed with me as I began to do fieldwork in different places. So the kind of three themes are, as you can see from my title, gender, race, and the military. So what I found was that there was this rich literature by feminist scholars who were looking at the sort of gendered consequences of peacekeeping or the gendered makeup of peacekeeping. There was a key text in 2004 written by Shireen Razik, which was called Dark Threats, White Nights. In this account of peacekeeping, that Razik follows this incident of racial violence committed by peacekeepers against the peace kept by Canadian peacekeepers. And she follows this and documents the ways in which this case of violence committed by peacekeepers, is incorporated into the Canadian national mythology, really. In fact, the violence is actually erased by the very nature of the rhetoric of Canadian nationalism, that this, the global good guys can just, they just can't possibly be engaged in this kind of violence. In fact, she has a wonderful chapter, which is titled The Clean Snows of Petawawa. And she's talking about the memories of the military base and the blanket snow kind of horizon landscape that the Canadian military peacekeepers think of to sort of wish themselves away from what they describe as the heat and dust of Africa that sort of makes them, they argue that it made them crazy, in a sense, that being placed in this geographical space made them crazy enough to commit these acts. And as such, they should be sort of excused because this civilizing mission was sort of beyond their control. So Razik's account, really, really compelling account and critical account of peacekeeping. And then, of course, there were lots of texts that came out, which were, looking at masculinity. What does masculinity look like in peacekeeping? Is it very different from conventional soldiering? Like what happens? How do people, how do peacekeepers, how are they produced, right? If they are used to being trained for acts of violence, organized violence, then how do you suddenly put them into a space that requires them to work against that, work counter to that? So some of these books, some of these texts, really important, edited volumes and single authored volumes. Again, so I was looking at how I came into knowing peacekeeping through these texts. And if you look at a syllabus in peace and conflict studies, and you look at, the readings for the week on peacekeeping, they will almost never include these early texts. The more recent texts, for example, Lisa Holtman and colleagues' work from Uppsala, that's really about documenting the necessity of peacekeeping because it saves lives. And so there's quantitative evidence of why peacekeeping is needed. Or Lise Howard's book, The Power of Peacekeeping, which isn't about unpacking the power of peacekeeping institutions. It's about the potential power of peacekeeping if it was only ameliorated, if it was only made more effective, if the problems were solved by reforming peacekeeping. So these more recent texts which dominate peacekeeping scholarship are definitely reflect this problem-solving approach. They don't reflect these critical roots which you saw in 2000. So what I wanted to do in my book project is to look at, well, okay, so how can we tell a different story of peacekeeping and potentially end at a different conclusion about what should happen to peacekeeping? So Razik says, in the conclusion of her book from 2004, this book is not about, her book is not about, prescribing solutions to the problems of peacekeeping. She sort of says, I don't think that's the right question. So I decided to sort of think about peacekeeping a little bit differently. And so how I've come to think about peacekeeping is to see peacekeeping as an epistemic project. So I see peacekeeping as telling us something about, humanitarian work, humanitarian labor, humanitarian work as reflection of global governance ideas, rhetoric, discourse, and so on. And I see it as telling us something about what Clapham refers to, and Roger McGinty also refers to, the peace kept. So I call them the peace kept because they are precisely the objects of peacekeeping as an epistemic project. So Peacekeeping as an epistemic project, very briefly, is this, the organization of the United Nations, the spaces in which United Nations peacekeepers are deployed, where policies, programs, initiatives are created, the sites, the physical sites, but the social, economic, and political sites where the peace kept are managed, disciplined, and produced for us to know. So what I do is to go back to some of these critical interventions in the scholarship and sort of highlight, I guess, 3 areas which lead me to conclude that really the only conclusion that we can come to once we explore these problematic foundations of peacekeeping is to adopt an abolitionist approach, to adopt demilitarizing, an end to peacekeeping, really. So as I've given you a little bit of a flavor of what Racic argued in her book, and one of the concepts that she uses, she draws on Black radical and Black feminist theories. She draws on critical race studies. And she argues that actually you can look at peacekeeping as reflecting a global color line. So in my empirical work and in my field work, I spoke with a lot of peacekeepers from different backgrounds and, interviewed them and spent time with them. And you may not know, or you may know very well, that the majority of peacekeepers who are deployed or who are sent out are actually from Global South militaries, from Global South national militaries. So there's a disproportionate number of Global South peacekeepers, and in contrast to the sort of financial contributions, which come from the biggest financial contributions to UN peacekeeping actually come from nations that don't contribute any troops at all, really. In particular, like the US, but, also typical peacekeeping nations that you might come to mind. So Canada, which has had, for many years, not very many peacekeepers, Sweden, Norway, very small numbers, even though they're seen as quintessential peacekeeping nations. So I use Racic's concept of the color line, this line that is this racialized line that divides the civilized from the non-civilized and so on, to look at actually the global division of peacekeeping labor. And so you'll see that Global South militaries bear this burden. You'll perhaps not be surprised to know that when there have been initiatives to increase the number of female peacekeepers, they've almost always been deployed from Global South militaries. So what does it mean then to have the majority of this peacekeeping labor being occupied by Global South women and men? So this is one of the critiques that I have, which is that in a sense, all peacekeepers are not created equally. They're not paid equally. Well, they're paid equally by the UN, but the consequences of that pay and how it translates have very different impacts. So just to give you like a very brief example of differences in pay, you could imagine so a Canadian peacekeeper, and I'm talking about a military peacekeeper here, would be deployed, would get their salary back home. So they continue to get their salary, and then they might get something like a hazard pay allowance of, say, somewhere between $5,000 and $7,000 US a month. And that would be with a tax break. Most countries, most nations offer this as a kind of civil service rebate. And so that would be quite a bit different than perhaps, say, previously we would have had a Ukrainian police peacekeeper getting approximately a salary of, $900 US per month. And then they, depending on how they're deployed, they might have access to this $5,000 to $7,000 US per month, which would be substantially more than they were making in their regular salary. So there's different ways in which peacekeepers can be socially and economically mobile. Okay, so that's just one critical concept that I draw on. Another is this, this UN rhetoric of improving operational effectiveness, improving, making peacekeeping reflective of a more diverse group of military and militarized personnel. And so there's been this increase in female peacekeepers, right? Like, we need to get more women into this. This is going to make this more humane. This is going to make this better. This is going to reduce incidents of sexual exploitation and abuse. My time spent with Indian women police peacekeepers has been really fascinating. So for the most part, this group of women, what you really see is this persistence of patriarchal organization of peacekeeping spaces, right? So in fact, these 120 police women who were deployed to Liberia for about 7 years consecutively, they basically were not able to move around. They were not able to move around the country outside of their camp, their base very often. They had to move in kind of collective groups. They didn't have the kind of freedom that military officers often have to be mobile, to socialize in the city, and so on. And then what was fascinating in some of the fieldwork I did was that there was a medal parade on one of the sort of the final days of this particular deployment of these Indian women peacekeepers. And the medal parade involved, the highest UN officer, pinning medals onto their uniforms, onto their lapels. And then they, of course, had like a sort of performance of military, I guess, prowess in some ways that involved all these different activities, from loading a weapon blindfolded to culminating in the final performance of women, jumping through a burning ring of fire. So the female peacekeepers that participated in this medal parade had to show a kind of extraordinary, almost carnivalesque kind of performance of how overtrained they were, really. But then, in the irony, of course, of it is that they were allowed so little access actually to the peace kept and to other military personnel as well. So these kinds of remedies, and I think the feminist work really has persisted in sort of unpacking this. And then finally, the Marshall foundations, I think, of peacekeeping continue. Marshall time, Marshall space, the Marshall pervades the entire peacekeeping landscape. So from the moment that you sort of arrive as a researcher or an NGO worker, you are, sort of brought into, you are literally like sort of sucked into this kind of Marshall atmosphere. And so everything is run on these routines. And some of the work that I'm doing for another project is about zoning. You literally have, you literally become part of this military speak. You talk about things in ways like, I can't go into that neighborhood because that neighborhood is in the red zone. Local people begin to speak in these militarized terms. Okay, and then of course, all of this critical work has been, I think, fascinating, pulling out these issues of, sort of the persistence of patriarchal organization of peacekeeping, the ongoing Marshall politics of peacekeeping, and of course, this civilizing mission or this global color line. And in all of this, the peace kept continue to be eclipsed. Like, we don't really know anything after this critical literature and after this scholarship has developed, including the problem solving. We still don't have a sense of what the peace kept are experiencing, what they think of peacekeeping, what are their, ideas about a secure and peaceful future. So my conclusion in the book is really that if we look at the foundational thinking behind peacekeeping in regard to these three sort of themes around gender, around race, and around the Marshall, we kind of have to, in a sense, move towards this abolitionist approach. There is no recuperation, there's no remedy for peacekeeping because its foundations are, kind of corrupted. They're foundationally colonial, they're foundationally sexist, they're foundationally committed to a kind of military approach. And so, maybe just the last thing I could say is just that, drawing on the work of, say, Black feminists in the US who have been calling out, Black Lives Matter's responses as being themselves patriarchal, themselves upholding, men who have been killed by the police and calling for, defunding of the police and of abolishing the police. These feminists have said, yeah, but what about the women that have been actually killed by police? And I think if we think about these three critiques, then we have to actually think about peacekeeping being, as somebody who was reading my book said, peacekeeping is really truly the wretch that cannot be saved. That we can't reform it. It's fundamentally sort of corrupted at the heart. Okay, I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Marsha, for this insight into your work and into your book.